Session.
Morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Rabbi Stephen, for inviting me and for bearing with me after a couple of failed attempted sessions. So thank you very much for having me. And thanks, Dad, for coming and supporting as well. Appreciate it. And very nice to see all of you. So what we're going to hopefully do in the next few minutes is learn the first two Pesukim of this week's parasha coming up, Mitzvah and Vayelech. And we're going to hopefully take away four messages, things we can learn from these psukim, hopefully relevant to our lives, we can take going into Rosh Hashanah. So before learning these two psukim that we're going to be delving into, we just need some context, what's going on, where's the Jewish people standing at the start of this week's parasha, what's the context for what's happening. So Rashi helps us out. It says in our first source, so if you look at the source sheet, it's a little number next to each source. So on the first source, Rashi explains what's happening in the start of this week's parasha. That this was standing at the start of this week's parasha. Moshe is on the day of his death, he's about to pass away, and Moshe Rabbeinu, under the instruction of Hashem, gathers the Jewish people basically in a big team talk. Everyone's gathered around. It's Moshe's last hurrah, last farewell, and he's going to enter the Jewish people into a special covenant on this day and basically give his final messages, his final pieces of advice to the Jewish people as they prepare for the future without him. So we're now going to quickly go into the Pesukim. I've actually put in source two a few extra Pesukim, but really the main focus of the next few minutes is the first two Pesukim. So the Pesukim explain they in Devarim, chapter 29, Pasuk 9, Atem nitzavim hayom kolchem lifnei Hashem elekechem, Roshechem, Shiftechem, Ziknechem, V'shotechem, Kol Ish Yisrael. That Moshe is telling the Jewish people that you're standing today before you, all of you are standing here on this day before Hashem. And then, very interestingly, Moshe starts listing all the different categories of people that are actually standing there today. So he says the tribal heads, the elders, the officials, the householders, and then he goes even further in the next pasuk. Tapachem, nashichem, your children, your wives, the gerecha, the convert, the shebekerev machanecha, mechotev eitzecha, ad shoev mimecha, and even people from wood choppers to water drawers. So he says, rather than just saying all of you, he goes into a lot of detail explaining lots of different categories of people. So one question we're going to look into is for why exactly we have to go every single category. Could have just said in front of you today. And then just skim through the next few Pesukim, just explains we're here together to enter into this covenant, this new bris on this day. That just to go down a pasuk, to establish today that we're all going to become God's people in this special covenant, like Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And interestingly, just I brought these next few Pesukim just to draw out the last couple of lines. I'm making this covenant today, not just with you, everyone who's standing here in this big team talk. But also everyone who's not here today is also being bound by this covenant, which means every future Jewish generation that comes after this is also going to be bound to this covenant. So whether we like it or not, we're also wrapped into this covenant too. We're also part of it as well. Different explanations are given as to how we can all be sent into a covenant that we didn't actually agree to. Just one as a side point, one answer given is that there's an idea brought down in the Gemara and Megillah that a beis din is not able to be mevatel, he can't nullify something which a previous beis din has decided unless it's a gadol men chacham of a minion, unless it's bigger in numbers and in wisdom. And since we've sort of gone down and down and down in terms of our righteousness and our godless, therefore we're not able to overturn what was decided previously, and therefore we are sort of stuck in this covenant also. So that's the backdrop. We have these psukim. We haven't even started going into any detail. We've just said we're all here together today, and we're going to join a bris. We're going to learn four lessons from just these first two psukim. So number one, we sort of touched upon this before. The Orach Chaim asks a very, very simple question in source number 3. Sarich ledas kavanas ma'amazeh. We need to understand what's the intention of the pasuk. Why do we need to mention every single category? It could have just said, Lo hispig loma b'derech klal kolchem. It could have just said simply, everyone. Why do we have to go into such big detail and to explain every single category? And we know the Torah doesn't waste any letters, any words. Every drop of ink is very, very precious. So what's going on here? And the Orach Chaim brings down a really, really important lesson. Venera Lee, the second paragraph, he kavanas Moshe b'bris zeh. The intention of Moshe when he gathered together to make this big covenant was lahachnisam ba'arevus zel zeh, was to tell the Jewish people a very, and the same way that together everyone equally is joining into this covenant, whether you're a tribal leader, whether you're the highest person in society, whether you're a wood chopper, a water drawer, everyone is part of this covenant. Everyone's part of this people on an equal level. Everyone's in it together, and it's this idea: Kol Yisrael Arevim Zel Hazeh. We're all one people. We're all grouping in together, and everyone's on the same team, and everyone's equally important. And we see this idea also when the Jewish people received the Torah that we saw. We were echad v'leiv echad. We're all one people, and we should really take this point that there are really two levels. On a simple level, it means everyone's got a responsibility to make sure that everyone's on the right path, everyone's doing mitzvahs, everyone's doing the right thing. But I think also there's a deeper level as well, the idea that we're all one people. I was in Israel when the war broke out. And on the next day, October 8th, I remember going into shul the next morning, and I'm looking around, and there's lots of faces. It was a very tight-knit community, and there were loads of faces that I didn't recognize, and I was very confused who all these people coming in. The shul had half of the shul of people that I didn't recognize. So I went over to the Gabbai, and he told me these are all people that have come from the north, evacuated, and they've come down, and they were sheltering in a local school. And I walked out of shul that day, and I started seeing in the streets that people were taking washing machines and tumble dryers and literally dumping them in the middle of the street and having extension cords and putting them through windows. And literally infrastructure to help these people was appearing everywhere: washing machines, tumble dryers, just large pots of food. And it was a really incredible thing to witness and to see that despite all the terror that was going on, one of my biggest memories was that feeling of unity, that people were looking after each other. And I think really that is the deeper level of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zel Hazeh. It's not just that we are guarantors for each other, but really it means that we're all grouped together as one people, and we're essentially all brothers and sisters. And therefore, a direct impact of that is everyone looks after each other. And we saw that very, very nicely, I thought, when the war started, that everyone was clubbing together, looking after each other. And I think this is what the Orach Chaim is telling us, that it doesn't matter whether you're very, very high in society or whether you're a very low in society, everyone is together and everyone has responsibility over each other. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two. We go back to the first pasuk. It says, Atem nitzavim hayom. Why does the Torah have to say hayom? Everyone's there. They know it's today. It's like me saying, we're here together for this year today, but we know it wasn't yesterday, it's not tomorrow. We know that it's today. So again, why is the Torah telling us that this big gathering was hayom? And just as a preface, the answer I'd like to read together, one of my favorite Gemaras in Herszaft comes the last Gemara in Maseches Machir. Now we had walking along in Jerusalem, three of the great Tanaim were walking in Jerusalem, Rabbi Akiva and two others, and the Gemara tells an incredible story. I'm going to read it inside, maybe skip around a little bit, but starting from the top. Shupam Achas Hayu Olin Yerushalayim. These three great rabbis are walking together in Jerusalem. Kevan Shigula Haratzofim Karu Bigdehem. And they reached Haratzofim, which is a point in Jerusalem where they were able to see the ruins of the Beis Hamikdash, the temple, which was just recently destroyed. And obviously they started rendering their garments, as one is supposed to do when they see the ruins of the temple. They started rendering their garments. Kevan Shigula Harabayis. And they went even closer and they reached Harabayis, which is where now, just beyond where the Kotel is. And Ra'u Shu'ul Shiyatza Mebeis Kadshe Kadoshim. And they saw there was a fox that was roaming around the Holy of Holies, the most holy place in the world. And it was an incredibly bitter and sad moment. And the two rabbis started bawling their eyes out. They were so distraught and devastated. But Rabbi Akiva started laughing. Seems very strange. Why is he laughing, seeing such a chutzpah, a degradation of a fox walking over the Holy of Holies? mipnei ma ata mitzachek. He said, why on earth are you laughing, Rabbi Akiva? Amar lahem mipnei atem bochim. He said to them, I don't understand why you're crying. So they're going to both explain. Amrula, the reason why we're obviously crying, because Makum Shakasabo, the Torah says about this place right here where the foxes are, Vahazar Hakarev Yumas. If any human being who hasn't got permission to be there, anyone who's not a Kohen Gadol, goes there, they're going to immediately die on the spot. Be zapped out. There's a laser from space will zap them out and they'll die on the spot. And now this very same place, there are foxes that are walking along there freely, and they're obviously fine. How could he not be crying? Rabbi Akiva explains something incredible. He says, based on the pasuk, just going to skip a little bit, that there are two prophecies, one by Uriah and one by Zechariah, and the pasuk puts them together to teach us Talah Kasav Nevuasa Shel Zechariah, the Nevuasa Shel Uriah. That clearly these two prophecies are contingent upon each other. That if one happens, it means the other one's also going to happen. The first one is the first prophecy says, Lachein begalchem tzion sada techaresh, that the fields of Zion, the fields of Jerusalem, will be plowed over and totally destroyed. But then straight afterwards, Zechariah comes along and says, Od yesh v'zakenim v'zakenis b'rechovos Yerushalayim. That even though at one point you're going to have Jerusalem plowed over and going to be in ruins, at another point in the future, you're going to have old men, old women, children running and dancing in the streets of Jerusalem again. Rabbi Akiva explains, Ad shelo niskaima nevuasa shel Uriah hayisi misyare shelo tiskaima nevuasa shel Zechariah. Rabbi Akiva explains, until I saw the prophecy of Uriah coming true about Jerusalem being plowed over and being put in this terrible state, I was worried that Zechariah's prophecy about once again there being people in Jerusalem and being rebuilt again. And now that I've seen the foxes that are walking along here, and clearly the first prophecy is happening, I know for a fact now that this is going to be short-lived, and in the future, Jerusalem's going to be rebuilt again. And once again, there'll be people that are walking in the streets of Jerusalem, old people, which shows there's no war there, and children will be dancing along in the streets again. And then these two rabbis were incredibly uplifted, and they said famously, Veloshin Hazeh Amru Akiva Nechamtanu, Akiva Nechamtanu. Rabbi Akiva had this incredible glasses and vision that he was able to see beyond what was happening currently. That even though things seemed terrible and things were really difficult, and there was a fox has shown the ultimate chutzpah to the holiest place, ultimately he was able to see beyond that things would ultimately get better. Explains Rashi in source number 5. Why do we have this mention of Hayom? And quoting, making reference of the Gemara in Sanhedrin, he explains, Hayom hazeh shehu kaya behu, ma'afil umeir, in the same way that the day follows night, and as night's very, very dark, and then afterwards the sun comes out, or in here, the moon goes away and it becomes light again. Kach heir lachem v'kach asir l'ha'ir lachem. Moshe is telling the Bnei Israel on his final speech that just the warning for everyone. We're not going to be in for the easiest ride. It's going to be very, very difficult times. But in the same way that the day, Hayom, always comes after Halayla, so too in Jewish history in the future, whenever things seem very, very difficult, you should all know that that's not how things are going to always be. And in the future, the good times will ultimately follow the bad times. And I think it's a very, very important lesson in every generation. We've always had very, very difficult times, Isurin, challenges, and it's the history of the Jewish people. But ultimately, Moshe is telling us that at the end of the day, the daytime will come after the nighttime and things will always get better. That's lesson number 2. So lesson number 1, we said everyone's mentioned together to show that we're all part of one nation, everyone's responsible for each other. And number 2, we've seen that just a lesson for future generations, that good times will always come after difficult times. Number 3, focusing in back again on the very, very first 2 words, atem and itzavim. The word nitzavim means to stand. And the basic question is, Jewish people generally don't like standing up. We rather sit down. We rather not be exerting our legs. Why was it important that everyone was standing up? And also, why does the Torah have to tell us that we're standing? Just say we're all gathered together. Why specify this word of standing? And very interestingly, Rashi points out in source number 6 that this sort of gathering together was not the only time in Jewish history this happened between leadership. Rashi explains Now, this exact same thing happened when Shmuel took over and also when Shaul took over. We've got this idea that whenever Jewish leadership changes, we go from one leader to the next leader, we have this sort of ceremony when everyone's gathering together. Rabbi Frand explains in source number 7, I'll explain it outside in his Sefer, Rabbi Frand on the parasha on page 339. He brings down Rabbi Bloch, who brings down a really, really novel and beautiful idea on how to understand our of him. He explains when the Torah tells us we're standing here today, that's not just in the literal sense of everyone standing, but rather it means that we are remaining in one place and we're just being and we're thinking. And he explains that people's lives are very, very hectic, constantly on the go. We're working, we have responsibilities, things are incredibly busy. And therefore, often what happens is people don't have a chance to sort of take stock as to what the plan is, what the bigger picture is, and where a person's going. And because we're so busy all the time, we lose sight as to what actually we're doing. We're constantly doing things, but not actually sure where that's ultimately leading. And therefore, Hashem decided that a fantastic time for people to take stock and to just sort of take a step back and think about what's going on, their direction individually, nationally, communally, is at massive transitional points. And therefore, as the leadership was about to change and things are going to be in upheaval anyway, there's going to be a massive change. That's actually a very ideal time to just sort of take a step back and to consider what we're doing in life and where we're going. And this idea in source number 8, Moshe Chaim Risotto explains in Mesilas Yesharim is actually one of the biggest tactics that's used by the Torah. I'm going to just sort of go through it outside, sort of skim through it. Explains that the Yetzer Hara uses this tactic that makes a person so busy all the time and constantly running from here to there that again they're like a blind person that's sort of wandering in the streets and isn't sure exactly where they're going. And he says that we actually have a precedent for this, not just in a person's spiritual growth, but also physically. That Paro explained that Paro made sure, we saw from the Pasuk, which says, Tichbat al-voda al-hanoshim, that what Paro did was he continually made the workload more and more and more to ensure that the Jewish people were working 20 hours a day. And they were so knackered and they were so exhausted that by the time they finished working, they didn't even realize how bad their situation was. They weren't able to have an uprising or to rebel or to even gather together to discuss how terrible their lives were because they were so busy all the time. And he says the Yetzer Hara does the exact same thing. Make sure we're constantly busy, we're constantly doing things. And therefore, we haven't actually got that opportunity to just sort of take a step back and to sort of try to work out what is our directional path. And he says that our challenge is to make sure we're not that blind person wandering, to make sure we're constantly stopping and we're assessing. And really, there's a broader idea that the Lubavitcher Rebbe says that the placement of each parasha in the calendar year is not a coincidence. So every parasha has lessons for us to learn based on the year. And therefore, Rabbi Bloch explains that it's no coincidence this always comes right before Rosh Hashanah. Because that's really the ideal time for us to take a step back and to consider what are we doing and what is our short-term and long-term goals. And finally, lesson number 4 explains, I always think back to when Alex Ferguson left United. The whole thing was doomed before it started. Everyone was lamenting and mourning, and it was like a funeral on his last game of the season. And even though you've got a brand new guy waiting to come in, David Moyes, fantastic manager, he was never going to succeed because it was like they were sitting shiva, and they never actually got out of that. And then by December, January time, they were still mourning Ferguson, and then it was over. It was done. Lahavdil, not exactly the same. Moshe Rabbeinu, the greatest leader of the Jewish people, is on his final speech. He's the greatest. Took us out of Egypt, received the Torah for us. He's the greatest. There'll never be Lekam Yisrael Kamosha Oz. There's no one ever again like him. And the Gemara explains in Baba Basra that Moshe was like the sun. Yoshua was a incredible leader, an incredible man, but he was like the moon. He was simply reflecting Moshe. And therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu gathered everyone together to make a really, really important point. Now, even though I'm about to retire, or more than retire, it's the end, and we're bringing in someone else, you shouldn't think that your future is going to be doom and gloom, and you shouldn't think that basically we're done and we're about to start a massive spiritual decline. Because ultimately, the future path the Jewish people take is in your hands. and he wanted to bring down this point that actually having a fresh start new. You shouldn't be saying, "I wish Moshe was here. This is so terrible. It's so tragic." You should be saying, "It's an opportunity to reinvent ourselves and to go on new starts." And again, this is not a coincidence that we read this and we see these ideas for Rosh Hashanah. Because on a personal level as well, we shouldn't be lamenting opportunities we had in the previous year, as in to a certain extent, yes, but also we should be looking forward to the next year and seeing how can we improve ourselves, how can we attack the new year with that freshness and these new opportunities. Just to recap our 4 lessons, and we've seen from just the first 2 pesukim of this week's parasha. Number one, we saw from the Orach Chaim's idea of collective responsibility, both in making sure that we're all doing mitzvahs and all on the right path, and making sure that if someone needs a sukkah to sit in, we'll help them give them our sukkah, Sheikh Halulav and Esra, to give them Shabbos meals, to help them, tzedakah, but also on a deeper level, to have that achdus, like I saw in Israel, people looking after each other. Lesson number 2 we saw is that the Torah mentions the word hayom to sort of give us a chizuk that in the future when times are difficult and we're having difficult times that are more like the Laila, the hayom is going to come afterwards and things will get better. Number 3, we were standing in a not necessarily a literal sense, but we were just sort of taking a step back from our daily lives and thinking about our direction of travel. And finally, number 4, we saw that it's actually also a fresh start, an opportunity for us to go forward, go from strength to strength, and not necessarily be Moshe's passing, but also an opportunity for us to greater things. Thank you very, very much, and wishing you all a good week.
Very much for that. Does anyone have any comments on that? Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much. I will turn off the Zoom. See you all next week on Zoom. And I'll do